We waited this month until the third Wednesday, even though our normal schedule is every other Wednesday. And we did that because when we planned this program, we anticipated the election might be contested here in the United States, and indeed it is. And that is part of the kind of government we have had over the last 4 years, which is now clearly over. And I will be talking about that election and its meanings and implications this evening as a major part of what we want the evening to discuss. Another difference is that it won't just be me this evening. I requested 6 people, some of whom, perhaps all of whom, you may know, or you may have seen or heard in the past. I've asked them to join me tonight to make, which they've done in recent days, short 4 or 5 minute videos, and you're going to see them this evening interspersed with my own presentation. So it will be, you might say, roughly half me and half people like Laura Flanders, Nomi Prince, Ley Kemp, Янис Варуфакис, Lee Carter, and Jessica Gordon Nemhart. All of these people have much to say, have different approaches, different priorities, and I believe their comments, together with my own, will make an interesting evening, an interesting set of ideas about where we are in the world today, with special emphasis on the United States because of the election, and that it will altogether be a worthwhile enterprise. So let me begin. Here in the United States, the election that we have just completed cost many, many billions, that's with a B, billions of dollars. In our country, here in the United States, 2 political parties have a completely stranglehold monopoly on politics, at least of the parliamentary electoral kind. The billions that they spent, each of them, to run for office, and we're talking many billions of dollars, this they both agree is a perfectly reasonable approach. They have had many opportunities to change the law, to limit the amount of money that can be spent, to limit the amount of time that the campaigns cover at great cost, and they have chosen not to stop it, not to end it, not to put limits. And so the money goes more and more. Each time our election is the costliest we have ever had. And so the many billions of dollars spent on the election, which both parties agreed to, happened at the same time that the 2 parties could not agree on a national strategy to cope with the COVID-19 crisis, which is why, one major reason why, that crisis is more devastating in the United States than perhaps any other country on the planet. They also couldn't spend those billions on a stimulus economic program here in the United States to do something about the tens of millions of people that are unemployed, underemployed, or underpaid. A catastrophic economic crisis for which these billions could not have been spent because the 2 parties couldn't agree in the months leading up to the election. It's an extraordinary testament to the reality in this culture here in the United States that the 2 political parties that operate together, and let me underscore together, the economic and political monopoly over our politics, it is interesting that both of these parties are 98% pro-capitalist. the two parties fall all over each other in supporting, celebrating, subsidizing capitalism. Why do I say 98%? Well, because 2%, it's a number I picked out of the hat, it's a very small number, 2% represent the socialists, those who are critical of capitalism, who say something inside the Democratic Party about some issues when they are not marginalized, silenced, or excluded, which happens to most of them most of the time. So in our monopolized politics, we do not have in the United States freedom of choice, the way other countries do. We pride ourselves in the United States on having freedom of choice. And in some areas, we do. If you go into a supermarket and you want to buy breakfast cereal, you have many different kinds, many different brands to choose from. If you go into an automobile dealership, you have different brands and different models to choose from. We want choice. We want the freedom to choose. Except in our politics, that minor area of life, where we only need two. And we need two that on the great question of capitalism, the system we live with, there is no choice, because choosing between one or the other lets you choose between one pro-capitalist political party and another pro-capitalist political party. They don't disagree on capitalism. They disagree on how best to support, subsidize, and build capitalism. When you choose between them, you're choosing between who will support capitalism. If you want to choose against the support of capitalism, you have no real political contender to vote for. The two parties have arranged things so you have no freedom of choice. It's charming because they preach the freedom of choice, but they don't practice the freedom of choice. And for those of you who care, it's even worse. The system in Europe, for example, is called proportional representation. It's a simple idea. It goes like this. If 20% of the people want a socialist party enough to vote for it, then 20% of the people sitting in Parliament writing the laws should be representatives of that party. The 20% want their voice heard when it comes to writing the law. They do not allow somebody who gets 51% of the vote to have all the seats in Parliament for whatever area they represent. In other words, in the United States, it's a winner-take-all, no proportional representation. If you don't win, you lose completely. If half or just below half the people voted for you, they have no representative writing the law. It's a bizarre way to minimize, to exclude, to marginalize new emerging political movements. It's what monopolists do. In economics, we call what monopolists do the erection of barriers to entry, making it impossible for new, proudly innovative companies to get off the ground because they can't afford the advertising that the monopolists do, or they haven't had the laws written for them the way the monopolists did, or they don't have the money to get the attention of the politician the way the monopolists did. Barriers to entering a business or an industry. Our political monopolists have created barriers to anybody who's critical of capitalism. So you can't find it. You can even find many Americans who can't imagine it. And so we have a system that reflects the monopolization of politics by two pro-capitalist parties who hand each other the government every few years in a ritual of political make-believe. And so we have deepening inequality. And so we had a system unprepared for a virus. And we had a system incapable of containing the virus. And a system that wasn't prepared for the latest capitalist business cycle crash. And that is now incapable of containing the social disaster that crash produces. We have all the costs of a dysfunctional, monopolized political system, but all with the polite agreement of the two monopolists never to discuss the monopoly they operate, but to pretend instead that they are fierce competitors, insisting that we all join with them in pretending that the competition between them is anything other than the collusion to squeeze out everybody else. Don't be fooled. This is a good moment for me to introduce the first of my guests this evening. Her name is Laura Flanders. She's an independent journalist who runs and produces a very interesting, long-standing television and radio show of important commentary, both on what is going on politically and what ought to be going on or is emerging or is beginning to change the political outline of the countryside. It is a pleasure for me to invite Laura to speak with us for a few minutes.
Hi, I'm Laura Flanders of The Laura Flanders Show. You can watch every week at YouTube or at lauraflanders.org or subscribe to the free podcast. I'm recording this message for Rick and your friends, surrounded by trees and dead leaves, because with respect to election 2020, I don't think we're out of the woods yet. We are in a dangerous moment. That moment when the lens of our media narrative narrows, and having been for a few glorious moments on masses of people in action, registering to vote, getting out to vote, voting, the lens narrows to just a couple of people in Washington, D.C. And yes, we've got some history being made in our Vice President, Kamala Harris. Our Vice President-elect and our President-elect are going to be new faces, with any luck, in Washington. But there's an awful lot about them that reminds us of the past. Joe Biden especially takes us back to that moment in 2008 when we had a financial crisis on our hands, a mortgage disaster, a houseless, homeless crisis looming, and an administration came into power that demobilized the masses, demobilized the activists who had helped to bring them to D.C. We're in a moment just like that again. And if you were around and paying attention in 12 years ago, you'll remember that the so-called relief package that the Obama-Biden administration brought in was nowhere near enough for the people's need. Now, Joe Biden needed we the people to get elected. We the people have needs that are urgent today, whether you're talking climate change or recession or racism or the pandemic. The people's needs are worse today than they were 12 years ago. So while we are going to need to be active in Washington and all around this country at the level of government, and we're going to have to be active in our movements at the level of keeping those fascist forces at bay, we, I think, particularly we that watches my show and that watches this show and that listens to our podcasts, the we that talks about economic alternatives has got to get really serious. We are not the same as we were 12 years ago. Biden may be the same guy, but we have lived for more than a decade. And coming out of 2008, I think many of us said, you know, you got a point. We can't just be anti-capitalist. We have to be for something else. Well, we have spent 12 years laying out alternatives and saying that another world is possible. I think our agenda, this particular our agenda now is to give people the confidence that those alternatives can actually change their lives. So I think the message that I would like to send today is that what we're going to be doing on the Laura Flanders Show is following alternatives as they play out, talking about the obstacles that exist to really organizing the workplace and education and housing and healthcare differently. There are some extraordinary initiatives in the works, but can they get to scale? What stands in their way? Because I believe the experience of making a democratic society, not waiting for someone else to do it, but of making one right now where we live, where we are, in woods like these, that experience can help us build our movement power for the next time, whether that's 2 years or 4 years or 8 years from today. One of the things that we've been reporting on is the comparative success of worker-owned co-ops in this COVID economy, in this pandemic poverty. Worker-owned co-ops have, unlike most small businesses, come out fairly well. There have been fewer layoffs, more expansion, even new hirings at the businesses where the workers themselves could decide, sometimes on a dime, how to change their MO. We've seen people decide that they would take pay cuts to keep everybody employed. Check out the report from the U.S. Federation of Worker-Owned Cooperatives. That kind of experience of how an alternative works differently can change people. And I think that's what we have to build today. What happened in this last election? People got terrified and voted against Trump. People decided to hold their nose and vote for the old guy Biden. People got excited about the history-breaking nomination of Kamala Harris as as Biden's vice presidential candidate, and then a whole lot of other people did what they always do, which is organize no matter who, get busy doing no matter what, just to keep reactionary forces at bay and win some breathing room. We won some breathing room. Now we have to build in that breathing room so that people can not just see alternatives as ideas, but experience them, lived, and live the experience of making their lives different from the bottom up. Do we need federal help? Absolutely. Are we going to wait for that? We can't afford to. Whether it's giving one another care, defunding our police and finding alternative ways to keep our communities safe, addressing the recession, especially the she-cession that is affecting women and women of color most, or becoming sanctuary communities. We have to start that work where we are, and don't let anyone tell you that it's all and only now about what happens in Washington, D.C. For the Laura Flanders Show, I'm Laura Flanders. Check us out at lauraflanders.org. Podcast, TV show. We're probably on a public television station near you. I'm a big subscriber and regular listener to Economic Update. Thank you, Rick, for all you do.
Thank you, Laura. Let me introduce next an old friend, Nomi Prince, a former banker at Goldman Sachs who has changed her direction and applied her wonderful research and analytical capabilities to really telling us how the banking system works in the world. She writes, she's an author. Let me welcome Nomi Prince with her thoughts on this election and what it means.
The world, and slightly more than half of the United States, did breathe a collective sigh of relief last Saturday as the United States election was finally called for the Biden-Harris ticket. And though President Trump can mount any number of legal battles, they're not going to change the math. But it's also important to note that around 70 million people voted for Trump, and it would be dangerous to just discount that proportion of the population, their concerns, or even their positions. In terms of the rest of the lay of the land on the Hill, the runoff in Georgia would have to be a sweep in favor of the Democratic Party in order for the Democrats to even make the Senate even. But from a practical standpoint, even if there are tie vote situations where, say, Vice President-elect Kamala Harris would be casting that deciding vote, The reality is that Biden would need bipartisan support in case he loses a Democrat or two in any vote in order to get any major legislation passed. And that means the sort of legislation that he will be able to propose and get passed cannot be perceived to be rocking too many political boats. Also, since the House lost 7 Democratic seats, though it did retain the more progressive seats, it means that Nancy Pelosi, as Speaker of the House, will have less of a margin there. And that's going to be both with respect to the Republicans and between the more centrist and the more progressive arms of the Democratic Party. And what all that means is that passing legislation will just not be a walk in the park for anyone. And the Biden-Harris administration is going to have to pick its battles, which probably will therefore require them staying very much in the center of the road. Now, there's also a very strong likelihood that from a financial economic perspective, that say the Biden White House and a Republican or even a split Senate could reach compromises on a larger pandemic-related stimulus package, and that could also include extra vaccine-related funding and possibly, and hopefully actually, any infrastructure plan or package, which is something that Trump promised again and again during the 2016 election, but absolutely never delivered. And in fact, he thwarted the possibility of that by imposing various supply chain tariffs and trade wars along the way. This could also translate into continuing, though, to keep taxes lower for corporations, which is something that the Biden campaign platform said it would raise, although they never said that they would raise those taxes back to what they were before Trump anyway. So any ground that's gained on fiscal stimulus will, of course, be so positive for all of those Americans around the country that are struggling with the loss of jobs or money or loved ones due to this pandemic. And in that respect, it would also be positive for the general economy and for regaining global status and respect and adopting some sort of a stronger leadership position with respect to the virus, to mask wearing, and any other protocols that are necessary in fighting this pandemic. But all of that combined is the reason that global stock markets rallied since the election. The thing is, neither Wall Street nor the financial markets nor bankers particularly like uncertainty. But having the election out of the way, and with it the threat of random trade wars and tweets, coming on top of the ongoing no-limit monetary policy or the central bank support that's led by the Federal Reserve and copied around the world by every other central bank, is also why we're likely to see an ever-widening disconnect between the financial markets and the real economy, or what I have coined a permanent distortion. Now, there will be items that will be done by executive order in the meantime. Biden will re-sign the Paris Climate Accord. He will rejoin the World Health Organization. And he will have a national coronavirus plan, which we deeply have needed. I also think that he's going to push investment in green energy platforms and in projects. And that's not even just because of climate change and science, but it's also out of sheer economic and environmental necessity. That would help companies in the sustainable energy and infrastructure space create more jobs. That's also a reason that Wall Street has been putting its money behind that policy in all sorts of green and ESG types of funds and private equity companies and so forth. So nothing will fundamentally change, though, for Wall Street or the Fed or other central banks. The markets are going to continue their disconnect from the real economy as we move on to 2021, perhaps even more so than they did under Trump because of the removal of that tweet uncertainty element. The economic uncertainty and disparity that drove many of those suburban voters that even voted for the Biden-Harris ticket to the suburbs to begin with, because they are cheaper, that's a phenomenon that's going to grow. And that's because of where we are right now in terms of the state of the economy. It's because of the pandemic. It's because of the associated work-from-home patterns and the general economic fragility amongst all of our citizens. Plus, let's not forget, Biden was heavily favored by Wall Street. In fact, Wall Street provided him more in campaign donations this election than for both of Obama's elections combined, and absolutely more than it gave to Trump's re-election bid. That's because, again, Wall Street values Democratic centrist certainty over Trump capriciousness. So it's unlikely a Biden-Harris White House would do much to decrease Wall Street influence or increase regulations on Wall Street, or therefore to cut into permanent distortion overall, absent more grassroots pushing. There's still an opportunity to reduce the gap between the markets and the real economy. It's just that numerically, it's not something that's an obvious outcome from this election. I'm Nomi Prenz, and that's my take.
Thank you, Nomi. And for the third in a row, before I make a few comments myself again, let me introduce Ley Kemp. Many call him a comedian, which indeed he is, but he's also a very astute commentator on the passing political scene here in the United States, but also beyond. So it is a pleasure, with a smile and a twinkle, as well as an appreciation, for me to introduce to you Ley Kemp.
Hello, I'm Ley Kemp, host of Redacted Tonight. So, the election is finally over, but that doesn't mean the mainstream corporate media is actually talking about the things they should be talking about, by design. And that's because they only cover surface-level analysis. You see, there's 3 or 4 levels of reality that we should be discussing when we talk about this election or any American election. And by discussing, I mean screaming about. And by screaming about, I mean freaking the f*** out. So let's freak out, shall we? Can we freak out together? Quick tangent, I actually got made fun of a lot as a kid for freaking out or spazzing out, as they called it. But when you think about it, when you really look around at reality, shouldn't we all be freaking out? I mean, so few people are enjoying their lives, so many people are struggling or oppressed, and there's new bizarre illnesses and viruses to worry about, and all of our so-called leaders are goddamn corrupt morons. And then you've got like a wedgie that's riding up your crack, and you can't grab it because you got your hands full. You got a drink in one hand, you got a video game remote or a baby or something in the other. So the wedgie just gets worse and worse and worse until it all comes crashing down. Point being, shouldn't we be spazzing out? If you look at reality, it's all spaz-worthy. I think everyone can agree on that. Anyway, we have 3 or 4 levels of reality that we should be talking about all of the time because they're incredibly important. But most of the time, average people and our media don't talk about all the layers. In fact, they only talk about the surface layer because our media is corporate tools. That's what they are. That's why they're there. So using this past election, using this election that we just saw as an example, layer 1 was who's going to win, Biden or Trump. That's the surface layer, right? It was fair to talk about that. I'm not saying don't talk about it. Fair to have a debate about it. But if you leave it at that and never dig deeper, you don't know what you're talking about. It would be like licking the top crust of an apple pie and saying, all right, I get it. It tastes like crust. But that's not all there is. You gotta dig down, idiot. Now let's get to layer 2, which is already a layer beyond what your mainstream corporate media will ever talk about. They only ever allow discussion on layer 1. Layer 2 is slightly deeper. It's that the oligarchy in America wins every election, no matter what. They win it in multiple ways. One is by making sure progressives and socialists and libertarians, etc., are purged from the process. The other is by money. And the third, perhaps most important way, is that our system simply does not pass anything through our government that isn't beneficial to the business community, aka corporate America. A large Princeton study found, I like to talk about it a lot, it studied 1,779 policy initiatives, policy topics, and it found that the American public has zero impact on what gets passed. What we want doesn't matter. They tell you it does, they act like they care, but nothing you and I want ever gets done unless it aligns with corporate interests. It's like being in an emotionally and mentally abusive relationship. They gaslight us. They tell us that we matter. They tell us they love us. They tell us they'll change, and they never do. They're just sitting there. They're just sitting there not changing, sitting there in their pajamas eating ice cream out of the box with their feet on the coffee table, putting coconut sprinkles in there into the ice cream, into the box when you don't like coconut sprinkles because it's tasteless in ice cream. And 2 days later, you find 3 in your mouth, and it tastes like hair or scabs or something. You know, I can get ready for a coconut sprinkle if I know it's coming, but if it's a surprise, it's just you think you have scabs in your ice cream. They know that, and they don't care. They don't care. But that's my life. Point being, at the end of the day, we, the people, get nothing done in our government unless it aligns with business interests. Look at Obamacare, for example. America wanted health care, but in order to get it passed, the ruling elite made sure it was a giant giveaway to the health insurance industry. Wow, sounds like layer 2 is kind of important. But nope, let's never mention it in the mainstream media. Let's pretend it's never happening. Layer 3, we should really be talking about capitalism and environmental collapse. Under our economic system, the most powerful people, the corporatocracy, will eventually own everything, no matter what. The gravity in capitalism will always be towards corporate hegemony, every time, in every way. You can sometimes score roadblocks that slow them down, but that's all it does, slow them down. As they take control, the environment, as in the natural world, will suck. I learned that word from reading medical textbooks. Sucks. Take, for example, Monsanto Roundup herbicide. We know it's causing cancer, it's killing people, but more importantly, it's killing the bees and the insects. And unfortunately, the natural world needs those little, right? You can't exist without it. You might love that there aren't any gnats left, but nature is screwed. And as all the bees disappear and the insects disappear, we eventually will disappear. Maybe not this week, but it won't be long. Point being, how could this happen? How could we why hasn't Monsanto been stopped at any point? Well, they're too freaking powerful. They own the market, they own the officials, they own the regulators, they even own the science. How can a squad buy up the science? I don't know, but they did it. So that's what talking about level 3 looks like. It's talking about the economic system, the global impact. And yet again, the corporate media will never get to that discussion. Level 3 is more off limits for a cable news anchor than for the female anchors to not shave their pits. And yes, I know that's a standard old school gender role, but I'm just saying, point is, the odds of seeing that on one of those reporters is not common. It's as screws up. You know, it's as common as them digging into our capitalist system. That's all I meant by it. I'm totally down. If you want to have a giant Krusty the Clown hair under your pits, I'm totally cool with it. Level 4. Now we really get deep. This is the true analysis of our reality. And there are a lot of different topics on level 4. You know, there's things like, what is money? Really? What is it? Is it anything? Where does it come from? What does it really mean? Or here's another one. What the hell are nation states? Why is everything have to be put in a box of national interests? What does it matter if I was born on this side of the line or that side of this line that was... Who even drew these dumb lines hundreds of years ago? Or it could be something like, why do we live the way we do in houses? Why do we live in such seclusion boxes, hardly interacting with our fellow humans, except at our wage slavery jobs where we go, hey, Jim, it's hump day. Ha, 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 ha. That's level 4. What the hell is that for existence? That's getting pretty deep into the philosophical realm. But how is it our media don't think that's important, ever? They don't think it makes sense to occasionally discuss level 4 of our reality, really dig down, figure it out, ask the questions, right? I'm not saying it has to be the beginning of every newscast. Hello, nation, it's 6 p.m., and remember, you're a victim of wage slavery, forced to live in a seclusion box. I'm not saying that. But can't the deepest echelons of our reality ever come up in the mainstream narrative? Or we just have to go buy some hidden book down in a basement somewhere a bookstore run by a guy with food stuck in his curly mustache and one glass eye. Is that the only place we can learn about this stuff? Point being, those are the 4 layers of our reality. There are more layers, such as the fact that we're all energy waves and crazy shit like that, but we'll just stop at 4 for now. There are 4 crucial levels of our reality. And your media, your teachers, your leaders, most of your information sources never, and I mean never, get past level 1. That's like going to school and they just never teach you anything beyond how to color inside the lines with your crayons. That's it. Through all of high school, middle school, it's just color inside the lines. That'd be the entire education. We are left at level 1 because it serves as a beautiful distraction. Never talk about the economic system. Never talk about how nations are used to divide us. Never talk about how corporations own our society. You just discuss level 1. Who will win the presidential election? Who will win the race for governor? Etc., etc., blah, 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 bull. Dig deeper. If you don't do it for your own curiosity, do it because they don't want you to.
Thank you, Lee. Folks, I'd like to turn to another dimension of our election that has been particularly in evidence in the final months before the vote and in the days since the vote. The phrase, saving our democracy, have been articulated over and over again. Interestingly, they've been articulated by both sides in the monopolized political race, by the Trump Republicans and by the Biden Democrats. Each one wraps himself or herself in the mantle of the savior of democracy. The fact that people so otherwise opposed can both use that phrase, although I admit it's more often heard from the Democrats than the Republicans, but nonetheless, each side believes it represents the majority, it represents the real America. In fact, many on the Republican side believe that the democracy is what they turn to as the guarantor that they in fact won the election. In contrast, Biden, Harris, and the Democrats, who use the phrase more often, saving democracy, like to picture Mr. Trump and the Republicans as riding roughshod over democracy, ignoring democracy, doing it now by not conceding the electoral defeat, but doing it earlier by using governmental power rather than getting the mass of people to choose in a democratic way whatever direction is to be taken. So I found it interesting that the saving of democracy, or more particularly the saving of our democracy, was so often on the lips. Okay, I want to comment on the use of the phrase democracy or our democracy, having just gone through this election. Well, in a way, I have already commented on it. It's not a democracy if 2 political parties monopolize political discourse. It's not democracy if a presidential candidate's debate excludes all but the representatives of those 2 parties. It's not democracy if you allow an extremely unequal economic system like ours to pour virtually limitless amounts of money into the electoral process, because any notion of a democratic decision-making is undermined when some people have the kinds of resources to spend literally billions of dollars, as we know was spent, promoting one or another candidate. And of course, the billions that were spent promoted Republicans and Democrats. The tiny other parties in this country, kept tiny in and by this system, could not, of course, raise anything like these amounts of money, which is part of why they are so small that perhaps many of you don't even know that they exist or that they contested the election. But you know, the absurdity of calling this system democratic runs deeper than our political system. Let me explain. Let's turn to the economy. Let's turn to whether democracy is a concept that applies to the economy of the United States. And let me be clear on what definition of democracy I'm working with here, so there's no misunderstanding. By democracy, I mean a system which works according to the following basic rule. If you are affected by a decision, you therefore have the right to participate in that decision. You cannot be excluded from that decision, and therefore you don't have a democracy if there is a systematic, structurally enshrined exclusion of many people directly affected by a decision from any role in it. So I'm going to give you just two examples of how the economic system of the United States is not only not democratic, but is actively anti-democratic. Let me start with the market, perhaps the most celebrated institution in the American economy, and indeed in many around the world. An institution variously celebrated for being mankind's highest achievement, for being a paragon of efficiency, and so on. Here's a quality of the market you might want to think about. Let's suppose something in a market becomes scarce. And that all that I mean by scarce is that there are more people who want something, who demand it, than there are supplies of that something to meet that demand. We have excess demand. Demand is greater than supply. Okay, now some distribution has to take place whenever and wherever that happens in a market. And the way the distribution works in a market is that the demanders become aware that the demand exceeds the supply, because that information is supposed to be available and readily available in a market, especially one that functions the way markets are supposed to. So now the demanders know, and the suppliers do, that the demand is greater than the supply. What happens? Well, in a market, the suppliers begin to raise the price because they know they can, because there are so many more people who want it that what they'll get is the purchase, even at the higher price, of those who can afford it. Meanwhile, the demanders understand the same thing. They know that there are more of them than there is available supply. So what those who are rich will do is bid up the price of the scarce items. That will force the poor to drop out, to stop demanding it, because they can't pay the rising price. And in the end, you will distribute the scarce supply to those who will pay the highest price for it. In short, a market distributes to the richest buyers when there's an excess of demand. What would be the democratic way to handle this? Simple. All those affected by this situation, that is, the people who demand more than there is, all of those people could together make a decision. One person, one vote. Namely, how do you handle scarcity? Who should get the scarce items and who should not? That's the real issue here. And that could be decided democratically. So, for example, if the scarce item were milk and the rich people wanted to buy it for their pets and the poor people wanted to buy it for their children, you might have a democratic decision to give it to the people who are using it to feed their children. You might. Markets are not a democratic institution, are they? Here's another example. How is a capitalist enterprise organized? Well, here's the answer. A tiny group of people sitting at the top of a capitalist organization, and you know who they are, the owner of the business, perhaps the one who started it, or the one who inherited it, or the one who stole it, or the one who bought it. The owner sits at the top. If it's a corporate form of business, it's a group of major shareholders, those who own the bulk of the common shares issued by the company. And they in turn elect, these major shareholders, a board of directors that sits at the top of a corporation. Board of directors, usually 15, 20 people. Employees, dozens, hundreds, thousands, hundreds of thousands, or with Amazon and a few others, millions of workers, of employees. All the power sits in the hands of the top, a tiny minority of those involved in the enterprise. They make all the key decisions: what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the profits that all of the employees helped to produce. The decision, the disposition of all of those profits, all of that's done by a tiny, unaccountable minority. There's nothing democratic about it. Could there be democratic decision-making inside enterprises? You bet. It has a name. It exists. Worker co-ops. One person, one vote. Everybody involved in an enterprise. One person, one vote. And we decide, democratic majority rule, what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the output, the revenue, the profits. Sure, you could have a democratic enterprise, but in capitalism, you don't. So then what in the world is the meaning of saving our democracy? It is very hard to save what you do not have. But that honesty, that self-awareness is not allowed into public discourse. No, not in the United States, where we have everyone pretending they're a democracy. Trump uses it. The Republicans use it. Biden uses it. The Democrats use it. Everybody is saving democracy. The only problem is it isn't there.